when you talk about labor, you're talking about what is the productive model. And if we're just talking about splitting the pie, which is really what a lot of consumption struggles are about, then we miss the question of, well, how is the pie being made in the first place? And that's when, if you want to talk about a national project, that's what animates a national project.
Hey there, welcome back to Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. What comes next?
Did anybody buy anything on Prime Day?
I've been boycotting Amazon today. Not that I go on there today. Certainly didn't go on Amazon today.
I think in our distant future it will be a bank holiday. Prime Day.
Yeah.
We'll pick and say it's Prime Day.
It happens on every Prime number day.
Is that the way they've gone for the 17th? Because it's a Prime.
Oh shit.
I'm Alex Hochuli, and today we're taking a global look at cities and the urban struggles that animate national and municipal politics. We're discussing social movements around housing, rent, transport, and the right to the city. First, we're talking about cities in the global north. The first bit is us talking to Ben Bradlow about cities competing with one another to attract capital. Then you're going to hear a short interview with David Adler. David writes on urban development, focusing specifically on rent, which is the topic of the first 20 minutes. If you want to hear more from David Adler, check him out on episode 40 on centrist authoritarianism. But then the bulk of this episode is going to take a broader perspective on urban politics. Everyone now knows that for the first time in human history, a majority of the planet lives in cities. The former Third World used to be marked by its rural character, but no longer. So the Global South has rather become like the Global North, that is, urban. But here's the question. At the same time, are the cities of Europe and North America becoming increasingly like those of the Global South? That is, more segregated, extremely unequal, and with greater social exclusion than we've become accustomed to in the post-Second World War period. Joining us to take a wide-ranging look at these questions is Ben Bradlow, a PhD candidate in sociology at Brown and an expert on cities and urbanism, currently doing a comparative study of Johannesburg and São Paulo. One final note before we get started. We're now adding recommended readings in the show notes, as many of you have requested it. There's stuff in there from this program's guests, as well as articles and essays that touch on the ideas of this podcast. Glad to have you all with us, and if at the end of this program you've liked what you've heard, why not share it with your friends and enemies? Alright, so we're here to talk cities and urban struggles in the global north and south. I'm Alex Hochuli, and I'm joined by Ben Bradlow, as well as Alpha Bunga Bunga regulars Phil Cunliffe and George Hoare. So today we're recording this on Tuesday the 17th of July, which is, if you weren't aware, Prime Day. It's a thing that Amazon has made up to have sales. And this is notable for two reasons. One, because Spanish Amazon workers have gone on strike today, with workers in Germany, Poland, Italy, France, and elsewhere responding to a call for a transnational strike and also walking out in solidarity. But it's also notable for the fact, I think, that US cities have recently been falling over themselves to attract Amazon so that the corporation would set up its second headquarters in its municipality. And I guess it's notable because it's not an isolated incident. The so-called World City is mainly distinguished by the fact that it tries to attract and is able to attract global capital. And Ben, I know you on Twitter were quite critical of this. Any thoughts on this lovely day, Prime Day?
Yeah, so I'm interested in the Amazon issue in part just because I'm interested in this type of competition between cities that you were alluding to, but also because the city where I live has been involved in this competition as part of a joint bid between my city of Somerville and the city of Boston, which has shortlisted amongst the 20 cities that Amazon's still considering. I mean, many people know that the cities that have made bids have offered varying degrees of tax incentives and other types of financial incentives to try to attract Amazon, which I think is just fundamentally horrific to give up the public purse for a type of development that's really unlikely to benefit many of the cities that are benefit any municipal area in the country, but definitely not the vast majority of the cities that have actually put in bids. And the reason why is most of the cities that have put in bids are cities that have major affordability crises, especially in terms of housing and access to land. And they're also cities where municipal governments are already quite constrained with the degrees to which they're able to intervene to deal with these crises.
Okay, here are George, Phil, and myself talking to David Adler about rent.
So David, you work with Generation Rent, which examines issues connected to Britain's housing crisis, and anybody in London will have first-hand experience of this. Before we talk about some of your proposed solutions, could you tell us a little bit about how Britain's housing crisis sits alongside other housing crises? Just provide, I guess, some context for us, perhaps.
So I think Britain's housing crisis is a pretty extreme case, or I should not even qualify it. Britain's housing crisis is an extreme case of what happens when you open the floodgates to a kind of speculative investment in your housing market and you really turn homes into investment vehicles. So from 1971 to today, or to last year, I should say, the value of real estate in this country went from 60 billion total across all of Britain to 6 trillion pounds. So it's a 100-fold increase adjusted for inflation. And so you can imagine what happened in that process. A lot of people, I call this a dualization process. Many people got extremely wealthy. Those are the insiders, the lucky people who benefited in the asset bubble, or who continue to benefit from the asset bubble. There were the outsiders, people who were locked out of that process of wealth accumulation. And for those people who were locked out, they were, we might say, doubly screwed. So not only did they lose out on the gains of their neighbors, there's a great quote from Kindleberger that nothing is more upsetting than seeing your neighbor get rich. So not only do they have to watch their neighbors get rich, but they also had to suffer intensely in Britain's extremely unregulated private sector. So Britain, almost more than any other European country, has virtually no protections in its rental sector. Very few rights, there's no minimum tenancies, and you can be turfed out of your home for no reason under Section 21 of the Housing Act of 1988. So here in Britain, we're reaching kind of record highs of Section 21 evictions. We're reaching record highs of rough sleeping. Very few protections for people who are struggling in the private rental sector, where, you know, in a place like London, you have tenants paying upwards of 70% of their income on rent for really, really bad conditions. So there's a big fight happening to transition to a more humane, you might call it continental model of renting. But it's very hard, in particular, given that London is kind of structurally hooked, you know, sort of addicted to, we might sort of klepto real estate capital. So this country runs on and is kept afloat by very, very dark money laundering that's happening through its real estate sector. And so it creates a really intense kind of political economic puzzle in terms of how do you unwind and put an end to that money laundering without sending the country into a kind of recession, putting people into negative equity. So you can see how the fears of a deflationary spiral are propping up asset prices and screwing over those outsiders year on year on year.
David, so one of the solutions proffered to this is, you know, build more houses and so people can own their own houses. Your solution is renting rather than owning. Why is that? So, yes, this is my big heterodoxy, and if I can plug, I'm writing a book about as much. Go for it, plug away. This renter's utopia, but I shouldn't plug it too hard because I'm quite a bit away from finishing it. But, you know, the way I see it the
Finnish book utopia.
Yes, exactly. So the way I see it is that the cult of ownership is what got us into this mess, and it's not going to be what got us out of it. So, you know, ownership was promised as this great route to emancipation, and that's true in France, it's true in Britain, it's true in the United States, it's true in Australia, and it's true because of structural adjustment programs led by the IMF, the World Bank, around the world. So, you know, this great ownership lie is one of the most foundational economic models that we have, that home ownership is going to be the way in which we can boost growth, boost prosperity, boost stability, etc. Now that's been a lie in two crucial ways. In one crucial way, because it screwed over the people who bought into it, namely the homeowners that after the crash of 2008 were suffocating under debt and were foreclosed. 5 million foreclosures in the United States alone since 2007, and 600,000 in Spain. And it screwed over people who were locked out of that process, who never had access to that ownership dream. So in a word, it's created huge levels of inequality and, from a more economistic perspective, huge levels of inefficiency. Because the rush to create new homes and to speculate on that property market has siphoned a ton of money away from what we might call the real economy toward speculative, really unproductive investments in real estate. I mean, real estate really is a kind of great sucking sound in the British economy and in others as well. So my argument is very simply that social rent can get us out of that trap. That we need to decommodify housing in the same way we decommodify our other sort of fundamental rights. I mean, housing is the only good where governments say we need to increase the price prop up the price of housing. They would never say we need to prop up the price of bread or phones or shoes. So,
right.
so something's really odd there. But I think it's also a timely moment to be making that argument because most of us have been locked out of that great homeownership dream, or what I would call homeownership lie, and so we're stuck in the private rental sector, and we're the generation that has to kind of make the most of that. We've been exposed both to the great harms of living precariously in the private rental sector, but also to its great benefits. One piece of the great ownership lie is that it actually makes you more free. But no, it doesn't. You have to own a house. You're shackled to that property and to maintaining it. Renting also is a way of freeing us from the needs of ownership, to being able to be more flexible, to move around the world, to engage and move where to places, to communities where we want to engage. Re-engaging the notion of social ownership, not just as a way of reducing inequality, but also as a way of emancipating ourselves from the need to hoard, or to collect, to buy, and to own, I think is something that we need to highlight.
To close then, would you be able to link different attitudes to housing to different political positions for us? To what extent does the housing question in the UK capture the political kind of the problems of our era? I was trying to avoid saying contradictions because I didn't want it to be too obvious.
What's wrong with contradictions? Contradictions is a great word.
Okay.
Say it again.
How far does the housing question in the UK encapsulate the contradictions of the current order? There, I said it.
I think, to answer your question straight up, very well. So this is the core of my academic research, actually, is looking at the political economy of Britain's housing crisis. And the main argument that I make in my academic work is that housing markets are broadly polarizing. So as house prices rise, as Britain undergoes house price inflation, we see insiders and outsiders moving in opposite directions. Insiders become more conservative with less desire for welfare spending, less desire for government intervention, and renters, outsiders, become more encouraging welfare spending and move to a more radical position in terms of their preferences for government intervention. And I think that this is exactly what we saw in the general election in 2017. We saw homeowners continue to move, especially older and wealthier homeowners, move in a much more conservative direction to protect the value of their asset, which in this country has become also their pension. It's a country where the Bank of England, the chief economist of the Bank of England, Andy Haldane, has said that property is a better bet for retirement than your own pension. So we have a political and economic system that's premised on you hoarding wealth in your asset. And we saw that private renters who are moving to a much more radical position by dint of their exclusion from that process, coming out in record numbers to vote for an anti-austerity program that would build social ownership and encourage their inclusion. So, I think that the housing market is a good example of the polarization of economic outcomes and the role of economic inequality today. And I think if you look at the housing market, you can really understand the generational conflicts the class conflicts and the geographical conflicts taking place in Britain today. And so I'm working on a few papers linking sort of Brexit to house price inflation, linking the 2017 outcome to house price inflation. So I'd be happy to keep you updated on those. But the basic premise is that we need to, and where I take my political inspiration from, is to build on that sense of exclusion, not to repeat the mistakes of the past and try to get young people to buy their own properties, but to mobilize that radicalism, to take advantage of the sense that young people have been exposed to that great life ownership, and to build a new economic model and to build a kind of new mode of socialized post-capitalist property ownership from there.
Okay, and now it's back to Ben Bradlow for the main dish. So as we're going to look at cities in the global north and the south and maybe see if we can't draw out some generalizations from this, I wanted to ask you about your own research, because you look at democracy and inequality comparing Johannesburg, South Africa and São Paulo, Brazil. Would you be able to give us an overview of this and maybe also pull out some key comparative points? Like, are the challenges facing São Paulo and Joburg the same as those in Jakarta or Lagos or Mumbai or something?
So yeah, I mean, the way that I approach the study of cities is that the politics at the city level really matters. So, cities are always considered, and rightly so, as a subsidiary level of government. And so often what happens in cities is read off of what's happening nationally. But actually, we see a lot of variation in cities that otherwise you might expect to look similar, given what's happening at the national level. So the way the kind of setup for my research is that Brazil and South Africa had very similar conditions for transition to democracy in terms of the social base that was driving that transition. And the key elements that I think about are what has been referred to as a social movement unionist alliance of a new independent trade union federation, cultural groups, progressive religious groups, and neighborhood and social movements in urban areas. And the heart of that alliance in both Brazil and South Africa was in São Paulo and Joburg to a large extent, in terms of what city was most important for driving that alliance, which in both cases was aligned to a new programmatic party of the left. And so I take that and say, well, how capable has each city been in addressing the demands that those movements were making around access to urban services after transition to democracy? And basically, I'm looking at, well, how do movements transform state structures, but also then how do state structures transform movements? So it's not just a linear path. And in terms of the material outcomes that I look at in São Paulo and Joburg, São Paulo has done much better at delivering public goods like housing and sanitation networks, as well as public transportation networks than Joburg. And in São Paulo, you also see a degree of perpetual renewal in the movement sector that's both antagonistic to the state and reinforcing of state capacities to deliver to the demands that movements are making. Whereas in Johannesburg, you have a real atomization of the movement sector, and you don't really have any citywide movements for any urban goods, and very high degrees of localized and atomized protest.
Right. So to what extent, I guess, then, because it follows on from this, are city politics actually national politics in these places? Mm-hmm. To what extent are the contestations over the right to the city, over transport, over housing, and so on, actually things that become played out on the national political scale? So
Sao Paulo is a great case where you can see how that happens. the last 5 years, it happened in a bit of a twisted way, as Alex will be very familiar with, where you had protests that started about a transport fare hike that ended up being taken over by a largely middle and upper class coalition aligned to right-wing political parties that ended up producing a lot of the social basis for impeaching the president of the Workers' Party, the PT, and really backing a very politicized type of quote-unquote lawfare deployed in the name of anti-corruption. I think South Africa is a good counterexample where there's a lot of urban protest in Joburg and in South Africa in general, but there's no organizational mechanism to actually transmit the dynamism and anger that you see at the very local neighborhood level to even the citywide scale, let alone a national scale. And that's created opportunities for business elites, but also traditional rural elites to be much more influential in comparison to their urban activist counterparts in driving national politics.
Could I just jump in there, Ben? This is Phil. When you say there's no mechanism, what might that mechanism look like that would act as an effective counterpoint to traditional elites in those contexts?
So from the left, I think that citywide housing movements in places like Brazil, but not just in Brazil. If you look at some of the emergent left movements and parties in places like Spain, even Greece for a brief moment, you see how movements that often organize around urban issues but are constituted at the city scale can begin to build up to larger scales. From the right, I think a lot of people are still trying to interpret what happened in the Brazilian case, the exact organizational mechanism. But it's clear that there are large organizations like the Free Brazil movement, the MBL, that were able to transmit a lot of the street anger into the direction of supporting anti-corruption and right-wing politics in Brazil.
So, I mean, maybe regular listeners might be a bit more familiar with the Brazilian cases. We've covered it in the past, but so as not to get too drawn into the complications of Brazil specifically, because it's a hell of a lot of complication. One thing that would be interesting to draw out from that example of the street protests that emerge in Brazil, but which might have wider application, is the question of transport, because, I think, I don't know who said it, but if the fight for the democratization of the city in the 20th century was housing, does transport play that role in the 21st century? I mean, especially if we take it as a given that there are slums and informal forms of housing in city peripheries. If those already exist and you accept those, then the objective must surely be to connect them up and to have access to transport as a primary sort of political objective.
That's an interesting hypothesis, though I don't see yet anyway the evidence to support it, but it seems plausible to me. But the reason why I think housing is much easier to mobilize around is that it's a good that's much easier to deliver, and B, it's much more open to popular participation. Transportation is often a very technical and networked type of infrastructure, and where you see it becoming salient as a mobilizing issue is where there's already a sufficient baseline network that exists and a sufficient cross-class user base for that network. And Sao Paulo, it's a very car-driven city in a lot of ways, but you also have a lot of middle-class people who are using the public transportation network, even if it's only the subway system. And the protests that emerged around the transport fare were not just poor people living in the periphery of Sao Paulo. And so you had that cross-class user base that could mobilize around that issue. But I think in the growing urban centers of the South, especially in Africa and Asia, you just don't see the degree of elaboration of the transport network that would lead me to expect that to be an immediately, best candidate for urban mobilization.
That's interesting. And I guess in a lot of these places, I mean, I think you've spoken before about Johannesburg, where it's, the public transport system is really actually quite privatized. It's private minibuses running around from one place to another. And I think that's probably the case in a lot of megacities in the global South.
With their own idiosyncrasies, but the idea that the local government has a formal managerial stake in a unified public transport system is relatively novel in a lot of the emerging and growing urban centers of the South.
So just to pick up on this a little bit, I think so. Something Phil and Alex and I, and this is George, by the way, hello from one of the world cities, London, and I can see, just to paint listeners a bit of a picture, I can see Canary Wharf out my window as we're doing this. So we were sort of talking about this a little bit. The global South, perhaps much maligned term, used to be defined by some, at least, by its rural character, but now it seems increasingly defined by its urban character, and particularly some of these cities which we've talked about in previous episodes of the podcast: Tehran, Istanbul, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Lagos, Cairo, Mumbai, etc., etc. So I guess just to zoom out a little bit, do you think this increasing pace of urbanization is shifting the way we think about this kind of global north-south divide as a whole? And I think particularly, not to load too many questions on, but what do you think of the role of slums? So Mike Davis, this idea of urbanization without industrialization. What role do you think that plays in defining this global north and south that we might have?
Yeah, I mean, I just used the language, but I am increasingly not particularly animated by it, because I think that the kinds of divides and inequalities that have been seen to characterize the urban so-called global South have a lot of analogs in more industrialized countries as well. So I totally agree that urbanization without industrialization is very much a Southern phenomenon. But for example, if you want to talk about low state capacity with no democratic accountability or movements embeddedness leading to horrific service delivery outcomes, in the United States, I think you have one of the classic examples, which is contemporary Flint, Michigan, where you have a city that was taken over by the state government, the intermediate level of government, and the city is delivering poisoned water that nobody can drink for years at a time. So, in that sense, there's a slum-like character to life in Flint, Michigan. Urbanization without industrialization, I think, is increasingly a global phenomenon. I mean, between deindustrialization in the north and no industrialization in the south.
Well, this is something that we've spoken about, privately, but before, Ben, about how in some ways the politics and societies of the North are becoming perhaps increasingly like those in the global South, or that the kind of sharp divides that we used to maintain are kind of becoming a little bit more blurred, and regular listeners will be familiar with this topic as we've discussed it in the past. And I guess one way of kind of drawing that out as well. One thing that occurred to me is that some kind of swanky new apartment buildings high-rise apartment buildings in London, and incidentally, high-rises used to only be associated with social housing or lower income housing, and now you've got swanky new high-rises, which is a new thing for a city like London. But in places like that, in these new high-rises, you've got like pour doors. You've got separate entrances for areas of the new development which are reserved for lower income residents. And I mean, that just is obviously offensive to anyone with a sense of a democratic culture of a shared public space. But it did remind me that, in São Paulo, this is hardly an unknown thing. Any building which is slightly older than, let's say, 20 years, will have service elevators and a social elevator. Nowadays, discrimination is banned by law. You're not allowed to discriminate into who goes into the social elevator and who goes into the service elevator. But, this is still a visible form of segregation that's still there, or there's a legacy of that segregation. And yet, in some of the most developed, advanced bits of the global north, you're seeing a kind of replication of these sorts of forms of segregation.
Yeah, I think I think that's right. I mean, I'm involved in negotiating what's called a community benefits agreement with a large developer in my city. They're trying to turn it into a biotech downtown hub that's anticipated to be worth $1.5 billion. And that is the exact issue that's coming up with the big high-rise that's being planned in the first phase of this development. Is there going to be any public use for the development, let alone integration of affordable units within the actual building that the developers committed to as part of the structure? So yeah, I mean, if you're saying urbanism and even the architecture of North and South are bearing increasingly similar social realities, I think it's exactly right. But it doesn't always lead to the same political responses.
So actually, I had a question that maybe follows on here, and it's how do you place the Chinese model in this context? Because I think it seems there that these extremely strong state control over the movement of people has meant that the Chinese state has managed to prevent people moving en masse, although there's still a lot of in that context illegal migration into urban centres. So largely has avoided the problem of the creation of slums.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, and China has one of the most extreme forms of rationing access to public services since apartheid in South Africa, which is the hukou system.
Yeah.
So, and, South African apartheid state was reasonably efficient, but there's no state probably in world history that's been as efficient as the contemporary Chinese state. So, they've managed to avoid the issue of slums. They've also managed to be one of the few cases of contemporary industrialization. And they've sucked up a lot of global industrialization.
Yeah, it almost feels like in a lot of these discussions Sorry.
What's that?
No, indeed. I was just reinforcing your point that in a lot of these discussions about global inequality, we almost have to take China out of the equation because it seems such an important but particular case that it rather distorts the whole global picture.
Well, I don't think you need to take it out, but I think it can be explained in the same terms that you would explain what's happening in other places. But it reminds us that the whole world is not converging to the same exact single point. And that the outcome can be different, but explained through the same kinds of mechanisms.
That's a good point. Our listeners will like that. It's very nice.
I think to maybe move away from the global south and move to certain struggles in the global north, and then we can join up again at the end. It seems that I mean, this is hardly a novel point, but conflicts over housing and rent have taken center stage in all major cities in the global north, practically. And at the same time, and as part of this dynamic, it feels like all major cities in the West seem to be moving away or becoming increasingly distant from their own hinterlands. I mean, just as a personal note, I lived in London for 12 years, and over that period, which included the sort of 8 years after the 2008 crisis, where London was already very different to the rest of the country. And, about nearly a decade on from the 2008 crisis, it was a complete world away. And this seems to be something that's happening everywhere, and not just New York, but also, Vancouver. So I guess the question is, how important do we think these, questions of housing and rent are, especially as we were talking about, as you said before, there's more capacity to mobilize around that issue in the global south. Is that the case in the global north?
I think it is, and I think that the British case, which is really driven by London, is quite an extreme version of this. In part because London is just so dominant within the UK. But there is a bit of a political problem, because you are seeing more and more mobilization around affordability, which is really rent, in many North American and Western European cities. But one of the types of things that would really deal with the problem, beyond the specifically urban interventions, things like rent controls, massive new investments in public housing, in terms of like the regional economics that would actually deal with this, regional transport networks, investing in previously deindustrialized or former agricultural centers. It's hard to build those politics that unite the hinterland with the metropole. So there are limits to what can be done just in the metropole, and attacking landlord rentierism is not at this. I haven't seen a case in North America or Europe where that's been able to really attract a significant group of people in the hinterlands that could really build a political movement at the scale required to actually make those kinds of changes.
Yeah, and it certainly isn't coming from the top, because I think in most Western countries, there isn't any politics which aims at having a sort of national project in any sense of the word. So they're very happy to let the sort of major cities, the metropoles, surge ahead of the rest of the country, more interested in competing on the global, international scale than they are in developing the country as a whole.
Yeah, and I wouldn't just cast that as an absence of a national project. There is a project, and it's linked to a specific subset of urban populations. And, like in the U.S., one of the biggest groups that's financing the Democratic Party is the real estate sector, and you can define that kind of broadly. So it's real estate developers plus lawyers plus accountants, the whole ecosystem that drives the real estate sector. This is one of the largest donor bases of the Democratic Party. And so discussion of these issues is prevented from even reaching the national agenda. So it's only at the city scale where people are even talking about the issue of rent. In some European cases, it seems like the discussion around rent has become a bit more nationalized. But the power of both people who live in rural areas plus this more generalized role of the development sector in financing the Democratic Party makes it particularly difficult in the U.S.
Yeah. And I mean, just take another example. I was just thinking this on the way home before recording, that it does make you a little bit nostalgic for the kind of urbanism of the 19th and 20th century. I mean, if you view it kind of vaguely rather than look too much at the specifics. But, you know, if you look at parks, for example, in London or New York, it's almost amazing that these things exist. Like, if you stop and think about it for a second, you've got these massive unproductive spaces that people can just use freely. Like, you can just go in there and use this space. It's like, it's mad that it exists. You know, if you're attuned to how things are in the contemporary world. And I mean, I think that's probably the reality in most cities of the global south now. That there are no real shared public spaces, or there's few moments of maybe there's some moments in the 20th century history of a sort of modernist vision of creating public spaces, but contemporarily I don't know of any examples, and certainly in the global north you don't have that. You know, if there is going to be a park built, they're going to charge you entry. You know, that's the model. And that's quite striking, but I think we obviously shouldn't get weighed down by any nostalgia, because that's not coming back. I mean, that particular configuration isn't coming back.
Yeah, well, that particular configuration isn't coming back, but I do think there's something to what you're saying, and it means some real revisionism around figures like Robert Moses in New York, who's been vilified by urbanists for a long time, and for good reason, because he basically displaced hundreds of thousands of non-white people in New York City. But he was part of a generation of activist urban leadership that actually wanted to make, public amenities, which does not exist. But the one lesson that I would take for our contemporary times is that there is a role for activist political leadership in municipal government. And, the municipal state matters. And I guess that's the one key lesson that I'd take without getting too overly revisionist around the work of these kind of otherwise crazy madmen types.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point, which I guess isn't often made, and certainly isn't something that we often have discussed on this podcast, but the importance of municipal politics, because it's a kind of unsexy thing. They're often small local movements, but I guess if you can change the character of municipal politics.
Unsexy to you, Alex.
Sorry? Yeah, no, that's what I mean.
Unsexy to you.
No, I'm not kink shaming here, you know. You can find municipal politics sexy if you like. That's cool. But I mean, the transformations that can happen at that level, resulting from popular pressure from below, might actually begin to change things and eventually transmit to the national scale. I mean, I guess that's your proposition, as it were, intellectually, if not politically.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too romantic about that. I don't know, we're sticking on this metaphor, which I want to move away from. But I'm not saying municipalism is the answer. I'm saying that the kinds of things that begin to mobilize people often are at the municipal scale, and that municipal government is a key determining factor for where those mobilizations go. So it doesn't, achieving change at the municipal level is never enough. But it is a place where bigger things happen. And actually, Brazil is a fantastic case of that, because the story of the PT and the story of many of the gains that the PT achieved nationally under Lula and the first term of Dilma were made possible by a prior phase of the party where it was only in power in municipal governments, and built the track record, capacity, and connections with the movements that would eventually bring it to national power. And that, I think, it's not like a recipe that you just implement anywhere. but it's the kind of dynamics that I think make municipal politics promising for thinking about more contemporary problems, which otherwise seem hopelessly constituted at national or even global scales.
That's really interesting. To try to push you on being maybe a little bit more specific, do you think there is a particular theme or area which takes center stage in that? I mean, we've mentioned transport and housing, sanitation perhaps, or do you think a broader umbrella such as the right to the city is something that is worth going with, or is that too abstract?
I think there is some promise to the right to the city, but I also think it's pretty abstract. Brazil is one of the few places where it's that language has made it into the formal sphere of politics, but it's really been struggles around more concrete demands that have given some reality to an otherwise abstract concept like right to the city. The big problem with municipal politics only is that it's very hard to deal with the question of labor at the city scale. Economy, there's just, rather, at least in terms of municipal politics, it's very difficult to intervene in questions around labor, except at the margins. All that is to say, worker organization, whether it be in traditional trade unions or other kinds of forms of worker organization, aren't obsolete just because urban struggles around, material goods in the city are increasingly important. The labor question remains central, and it may be the most articulated question as these kinds of struggles scale up.
I think that's interesting because a lot of the struggles around the city tend to end up being some form or another of consumer protests. If it's around rent, it's about the rent being too damn high, which is a good slogan, but maybe not the most effective politics. Around transport, around the cost of transport. And so I guess it is hard to gain the sort of leverage necessary for these movements, as against political power that, people can be bought off in consumer politics quite easily. And it's also hard to make long-lasting, durable networks between consumers. They tend to be quite sporadic and spontaneous comings together. You can have a boycott which lasts for a short while, but it's hard to maintain that over a long period of time. So I think you're right to draw our attention to the role of labor. And I guess a question for looking to the future is, how to unite those struggles, because I think those sometimes more short-lived consumer struggles are not irrelevant, but I guess the question is, how do you join those things up?
Yeah, well, if I had an answer, then I don't know. I feel like other people would also have the answer. But yeah, I think that's $1 million question. And it's not just about labor. It's like the good Marxists I know you all are. When you talk about labor, you're talking about what is the productive model. And if we're just talking about splitting the pie, which is really what a lot of consumption struggles are about, then we miss the question of, well, how is the pie being made in the first place? And that's if you want to talk about a national project, that's what animates a national project.
That's a really brilliant point, I think, to end it on. So thanks very much, Ben. It was lovely to have you on. All right, that's it for this week. Thanks again to Ben Bradlow and to David Adler. So what are you going to listen to next? If you haven't checked them out yet, our past 2 episodes look at the concrete national politics of large countries in the semi-periphery, Colombia and Turkey. Our next 2 episodes coming up will deal with big ideas. First, we're taking a systematic look at how neoliberal heads have fallen off in the past 2 years. What's motivating the conspiracy theories, the Russophobia, the fear of populism, and more? That's the psychopolitics of neoliberal breakdown. Then in the second week of August, we're taking a deeper and more historical look at the contradictions of liberalism. Did liberalism really feature a unique dual birth, freedom and slavery conjoined at the hip? And if so, do freedom and anti-freedom continue to animate contemporary liberal ideas? All that to look forward to. Catch you later. Bye-bye.